The summer morning of 1942 began like any other at Ravensbrück concentration camp, 50 miles north of Berlin. Women prisoners filed to their work assignments, their wooden clogs echoing on the cobblestones, their striped uniforms already damp with sweat despite the early hour. Then the loudspeakers crackled to life with an announcement that sent waves of fear through the camp. 75 young Polish women were ordered to report to the Revier, the camp hospital. Their names were read alphabetically, each one landing like a hammer blow. Among them were students, girl guides, resistance fighters, teenagers who had been arrested for underground activities against the Nazi occupation of Poland. They had no idea why they had been selected, only that being summoned to the hospital rarely meant anything good. They gathered nervously, whispering questions no one could answer. Within hours, they would become subjects in medical experiments so brutal that the women who survived would be known forever as the rabbits of Ravensbrück, young girls used as laboratory animals in the name of Nazi science. Ravensbrück had opened in May 1939 as the primary concentration camp for women in the German Reich. Located in a picturesque area of forests and lakes near the town of Fürstenberg, the camp initially held political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and women classified as asocials. But as the war expanded and Nazi racial policies intensified, the population swelled with women from across occupied Europe. Polish women arrived in large numbers after the invasion of Poland, many of them arrested for resistance activities, for hiding Jews, for teaching in underground schools, or simply for being members of the educated elite that the Nazis sought to eliminate. By 1942, over 40,000 of Ravensbrück's prisoners were Polish, and it was from this population that the victims of medical experiments would be selected. The experiments were the brainchild of Professor Karl Gebhardt, chief of the orthopedic department at the University of Berlin and one of Germany's most prominent surgeons. Gebhardt was also the personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, and moved in the highest circles of Nazi power. In 1942, he faced a professional crisis that would have fatal consequences for dozens of young women. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime, had been assassinated in Prague by Czech resistance fighters. Heydrich died of septicemia after his wounds became infected, and sulfonamide drugs, the newly developed antibiotics, had failed to save him. Gebhardt had treated Heydrich and now faced questions about whether he had done everything possible. To defend his medical decisions and prove that sulfonamides were ineffective against battlefield infections, Gebhardt proposed human experiments. Himmler approved immediately, and Ravensbrück, with its population of expendable Polish women, became the laboratory. The selection of victims was deliberate and cruel. Gebhardt wanted young, healthy subjects to eliminate variables that might compromise the experimental results. The 75 women chosen were mostly in their late teens and early 20s, fit and strong despite months of camp imprisonment. Many had been university students before their arrest, members of the Polish intelligentsia that the Nazis were systematically destroying. They were girl guides who had taken oaths to help others, resistance couriers who had risked their lives for their country, daughters of professors and doctors and teachers. Now they would be reduced to research material, their bodies broken in the name of science that served no medical purpose beyond defending one doctor's reputation. The women were told they would receive minor surgery, that cooperation would improve their treatment in the camp. The lies continued until the moment they were brought into the operating theater and saw the equipment, the instruments, the SS doctors in their white coats. 19-year-old Wanda Pultowska, a university student from Lublin, was among the first group. She remembered being strapped to the operating table, her leg exposed, watching as Professor Gebhardt's assistant, Dr. Fritz Fischer, made an incision 5 to 8 centimeters long and up to 1.5 centimeters deep into her lower leg. The pain was excruciating despite inadequate anesthesia. Then came the real horror. Dr. Fischer deliberately introduced bacterial cultures into the wound. contaminating it with streptococcus, staphylococcus, and gas gangrene, diseases that killed soldiers on battlefields across Europe. The wound was then sewn shut, trapping the infection inside Wanda's leg, and she was carried back to the barracks to see what would happen. What happened was agony. Within hours, her leg began to swell. Fever consumed her body. The infection raged through tissue and muscle, causing pain so intense that she could not sleep, could not think, could not do anything except endure. The doctors monitored the progress of the infection clinically, taking notes, measuring temperatures, observing symptoms. Some women received sulfonamide treatment. Others received nothing, serving as control subjects. The women quickly realized that the drugs made no difference. The infections progressed identically whether treated or not, just as Gebhardt had predicted. His point was proven on the bodies of young women who had done nothing to deserve this fate, except be Polish and available. The first round of experiments ran from July through September 1942. But Gebhardt was not satisfied with simple infection studies. He wanted to prove that battlefield wounds with bone and tissue damage responded no better to sulfonamides than simple infections. This required more invasive procedures, operations that would deliberately cause the kinds of catastrophic injuries soldiers suffered in combat. In November 1942, a second round of experiments began. This time the doctors did not just infect wounds, they broke bones, removed sections of muscle and nerve, excised pieces of tibia and fibula, and created compound fractures. They wanted to simulate war injuries as closely as possible, which meant inflicting trauma that should have required months of recovery and expert surgical care. Instead, the women received minimal post-operative care, their wounds deliberately left to fester. 20-year-old Maria Kuzmierczuk underwent bone removal surgery in December 1942. The doctors cut deep into her leg, exposing the bone, then removed sections of it along with surrounding muscle tissue. The wound was contaminated with bacterial cultures and stitched shut. Maria developed massive infection, her leg swelling to grotesque proportions, turning dark with necrosis. She could not walk, could barely move without screaming. The pain was constant, unrelenting, worse than anything she had imagined possible. Other women suffered similar procedures. Some had nerves deliberately severed. Others had bone transplants attempted with sections of bone from one leg grafted onto another to see if the procedures would take. Still others had their bones shattered with hammers and left to heal incorrectly, creating permanent deformities. The postoperative care was deliberately inadequate, part of the experimental design. Many women received no pain medication at all. Dressings were changed irregularly or not at all, leaving wounds to rot under plaster casts. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, the only female physician involved in the experiments, became notorious for her cruelty. Survivors remembered her expressionless face, her glassy eyes, the way she would leave women suffering for days before changing their dressings, and how changing the dressings became a new form of torture as infected tissue stuck to the bandages and tore away when removed. Oberhäuser showed no pity, treating the screaming women as annoyances rather than human beings in unbearable pain. By early 1943, 5 of the rabbits had died from their infections, their bodies unable to fight the deliberate contamination. 6 more were executed with lethal injection once the doctors decided their usefulness as experimental subjects had ended. The remaining women lived in constant terror that they would be next. They developed a support network, secretly sharing food, water, and what little medicine they could obtain. Other prisoners in Ravensbruck, bound by solidarity and horror at what was being done, smuggled extra rations to the rabbits, who needed every calorie to fight their infections. The women who had been girl guides before the war remembered their oath to help others persevere and survive, and they made that their mission now, refusing to let the Nazis break them completely. The rabbits faced another threat beyond the experiments themselves.
Ravensbruck conducted regular selections where prisoners deemed too weak or sick to work were sent to be gassed or transported to killing centers. The rabbits, with their mutilated legs, their limps, their visible disabilities, were obvious targets for selection. They developed elaborate strategies to hide their condition. During roll calls and selections, they would lean on each other, supporting those who could not stand properly. They stuffed their pants with rags to create the illusion of normal leg shape. They bit down on pain to avoid limping, knowing that showing weakness meant death. The solidarity among the women was extraordinary, each one protecting the others, no woman left behind if it could be avoided. Some of the women found ways to document what was happening to them, understanding that bearing witness was crucial. They smuggled out letters written in code or with invisible ink made from urine. Maria Bielica, who worked in the camp bookbinding workshop, enlisted Czech workers to help smuggle messages to the outside world. The letters made their way to the Polish underground resistance, which transmitted the information to London. The BBC began broadcasting reports about medical experiments at Ravensbruck, naming Gebhardt and warning that those responsible would face justice after the war. The broadcasts reached even into the camp, spread by prisoners who had access to forbidden radios, and the knowledge that the world knew what was happening gave the rabbits hope and determination to survive as witnesses.
By the end of 1943, the experiments had concluded. Gebhardt had the data he needed to present at medical conferences, defending his treatment of Heydrich and arguing that sulfonamides were ineffective for serious infections. His conclusions were scientifically worthless, based on deliberately contaminated wounds that bore little resemblance to battlefield injuries, but they served his political purpose. The 74 women who had been subjects, 63 still alive, were left with permanent damage. Many could no longer walk without crutches or canes. Others lived with chronic pain, infections that never fully healed, nerve damage that caused constant agony. Their legs were scarred, deformed, mutilated. They had been young and healthy, and now they were crippled, their futures destroyed, for an experiment that had no legitimate medical value. But the rabbits were not just victims. They were also resistance fighters who refused to be silent. In February 1945, as the war neared its end and the SS began preparations to evacuate Ravensbruck, rumors spread that the rabbits would be executed to eliminate witnesses. The women, knowing that survival meant testimony, took desperate action. They went into hiding within the camp, supported by other prisoners who concealed them during selections. When evacuation orders came, they were smuggled into groups of prisoners being transferred to other locations, scattered to avoid mass execution. Some were hidden by sympathetic guards who had come to respect their courage. The women's determination to survive and testify became an act of defiance against the entire system that had tried to reduce them to experimental animals. Liberation came on April 30, 1945, when Soviet forces reached Ravensbruck. But the camp was mostly empty by then, evacuated by the SS in panic as the Red Army advanced. Most of the rabbits had already been moved, some to other camps, others freed during the chaos of the final weeks. The reunions that followed were emotional and complex. Families who had not known if their daughters were alive discovered them changed, physically and psychologically. The young women who had left for resistance work or university studies returned as disabled survivors of atrocities their families struggled to comprehend. Many carried guilt for surviving when so many others had died. All carried trauma that would haunt them for decades. The story of the rabbits did not end with liberation. In 1946 and 1947, during the Nuremberg doctors' trial, 4 of the surviving Polish women traveled to Germany to testify against their tormentors. Wanda Poltefoy, Jadwiga Gidi, Maria Broll-Platter, and Maria Kazmierczyk faced their abusers in the courtroom, showed their scars to the judges, and described in detail what had been done to them.
Their testimony was devastating. Gebhardt, Fischer, and Oberhauser all faced charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. The experiments had served no legitimate medical purpose, violated every principle of medical ethics, and constituted torture. Gebhardt and Fischer were convicted and executed. Oberhauser received 20 years in prison, though she was released after serving only 10 years. The sentences seemed inadequate to the women whose lives had been destroyed, but at least there had been accountability. The rabbits struggled to rebuild their lives in the decades after the war. Many could not work in physically demanding jobs due to their disabilities. Chronic pain was constant, requiring ongoing medical treatment that was often unavailable in post-war Poland. The psychological trauma manifested in nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty trusting medical professionals. Some married and had children, though pregnancy and childbirth were complicated by their injuries. Others remained single, the trauma too deep to allow for intimate relationships. All carried visible reminders of what had been done to them, the scars and deformities that could not be hidden, the limps that marked them as survivors of something terrible. Yet many of the rabbits channeled their experiences into advocacy and education. They spoke at schools and universities, wrote memoirs, gave interviews, ensuring that future generations would know what had happened at Ravensbruck. They became symbols of both Nazi brutality and human resilience, proof that victims could survive and testify and ensure that perpetrators faced justice. Wanda Poltofoy became a physician herself, specializing in helping other trauma survivors. She wrote extensively about her experiences and became an advocate for medical ethics, using her own story to illustrate why such experiments must never be repeated. In 1958, the surviving rabbits gathered in Poland for a reunion, their first since liberation. They shared stories, supported each other, and made a collective decision to continue bearing witness. They established connections that would last the rest of their lives, bound by experiences that no one else could truly understand. The reunion photograph shows women with canes and braces, their faces marked by pain and suffering, but also by determination. They had survived, and they would not let what happened to them be forgotten.
The medical experiments at Ravensbrück represented a perversion of everything medicine should be. The physicians who conducted them had taken oaths to do no harm, yet they deliberately inflicted suffering on healthy young women for purposes that served Nazi ideology rather than medical knowledge. The experiments produced no useful data, advanced no understanding of infection or wound treatment, and violated every ethical principle developed over centuries of medical practice. They were torture disguised as science, cruelty rationalized by white coats and medical degrees. The story of the rabbits also reveals the broader crime of Ravensbrück itself. The camp imprisoned over 130,000 women and children between 1939 and 1945. Approximately 50,000 died from disease, starvation, overwork, execution, or murder in the gas chamber that was constructed in early 1945. Women were worked to death in the textile factory, executed for resistance activities, gassed when they became too weak to work. Children born in the camp were often killed immediately or left to die from neglect. The cruelty was systematic, bureaucratic, and total. The children who passed through Ravensbrück deserve particular mention. Hundreds arrived with their mothers, some born in the camp itself. The Nazis showed them no mercy. Newborns were separated from mothers and killed, sometimes drowned, sometimes thrown into sealed rooms to suffocate, sometimes simply neglected until they died. The births that occurred in the camp between September 1944 and April 1945 were recorded. 522 babies born, 260 died within days or weeks. The survival rate for infants at Ravensbrück was appallingly low, a testament to the deliberate policy of not allowing children to live.
Pregnant women who arrived at the camp faced forced abortions or watched their babies murdered after birth. The psychological torture of these women, forced to bear witness to the deaths of their children, added another dimension to the camp's horrors. Among the child prisoners were also older children, some as young as 8 years old, particularly Roma children who were subjected to sterilization experiments in early 1945. These children underwent forced surgical procedures designed to render them permanently infertile, part of the Nazi program to eliminate populations deemed racially inferior. Many died from the procedures. Others survived with permanent damage to their bodies and psyches. The youngest victims of Ravensbrück represent the absolute moral bankruptcy of a regime that could systematically torture and murder children in the name of racial ideology. The women guards at Ravensbrück, over 150 during the camp's operation, complicate simple narratives about perpetrators and victims. Female overseers like Dorothea Binz, Greta Bosel, and Irma Grace participated enthusiastically in the brutality, beating prisoners, conducting selections for the gas chamber, and enforcing the cruel discipline that characterized the camp. Their involvement challenges assumptions that women would be more compassionate than male guards. Instead, they demonstrated that cruelty transcends gender, that anyone can become a perpetrator when ideology removes moral constraints and authority sanctions abuse. The liberation of Ravensbrück on April 30, 1945 by Soviet forces found approximately 3,500 prisoners still alive in the main camp, left behind because they were too sick to be evacuated. The Red Army soldiers who entered found scenes of horror, emaciated women barely able to stand, piles of corpses awaiting cremation, evidence of mass murder everywhere they looked. The liberators provided food, medical care, and transportation out of the camp, but recovery was slow. Many women died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. Others faced long journeys home to countries devastated by war, uncertain what they would find when they arrived.
For the rabbits, liberation meant the beginning of a different kind of struggle. They faced lives as disabled women in societies not prepared to accommodate or support them. The medical care they needed was often unavailable. The psychological support did not exist. They were expected to move on, to be grateful for survival, to not dwell on experiences that made others uncomfortable. But trauma does not work that way. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the chronic pain, all continued. Many struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms that would persist for decades. As the rabbits aged, their injuries created new medical challenges. Bones that had been broken and improperly healed caused arthritis and mobility problems. Tissue damage led to circulation issues. Nerve damage caused constant pain that increased with age. By the time they reached their 60s and 70s, many were wheelchair-bound, their bodies finally giving out after decades of fighting the damage done in their 20s. Yet even in old age, they continued to bear witness, understanding that their testimony was their weapon against forgetting. The last surviving rabbits died in the early 21st century. Wanda Poltavska lived until 2023, dying at age 102. She spent her final decades giving interviews, writing, and speaking about her experiences. Her longevity was remarkable given what her body had endured. When asked how she survived, she attributed it to faith, to the support of other prisoners, to sheer stubbornness, and to the determination to ensure that what happened at Ravensbrück would not be forgotten. Her death marked the end of an era, the loss of the last living witnesses who could describe what it meant to be a rabbit, to have your body used as an experiment, to survive against all odds. Today, the Ravensbrück Memorial Site preserves the history of the camp and honors the memory of all who suffered there.
The names of the 74 rabbits are documented, their stories told through exhibitions and educational programs. Visitors can see photographs of the women before and after the experiments, documentation of their injuries, and testimony from the Nuremberg trials. The site ensures that the medical crimes committed at Ravensbruck are not forgotten, that future generations understand what can happen when medicine abandons ethics and serves ideology instead of healing. The story of the rabbits of Ravensbruck is one of unimaginable cruelty met with extraordinary courage. These young women, many still teenagers when arrested, faced horrors that would have broken most people. Yet they survived, testified, and spent their lives ensuring that what happened to them would serve as warning and evidence. They were prisoners of war in the sense that they were enemy civilians held captive, but they were also prisoners of Nazi racial ideology and victims of medical crimes that violated every principle of human decency. Their suffering was real, their courage undeniable, and their legacy essential to understanding both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience.